Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Helen Joyce, Director of Advocacy at Sex Matters and also the author of the 2021 bestseller Trans, Where Ideology Meets Reality. We spoke today about fan fiction, which is something that Helen's been interested in for many years, why it is so incredibly popular among girls and young women, why it so often features romantic relationships between men, and why it seems to have become much more sexually explicit in recent years. In the extended version of the episode, we also spoke about the role of fanfic in changing our sexual culture, one, and also encouraging girls and young women to identify as trans or non-binary. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the bonus episodes I do fortnightly with my husband, the MMM chat community, and the back catalogue of extended episodes. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Helen, so why don't we start by talking about why you first became interested in fanfic as a topic?
Well, there was a bit of a backstory to it. It was while I was still at The Economist and I was doing a job as international editor, which was editing a section of the paper that would pick a big theme each week. And one week, the editor-in-chief said to me that 2 of the business journalists had written a piece about the business of pornography, specifically the move to free to view via Pornhub and so on. I mean, it's a classic Economist story, something that you used to have to pay for and now you don't. How are people making money out of it? But she was kind of uncomfortable about running it as a standalone piece. It's not a moral judgment for or against pornography. It wasn't intended to be. It was very much about the way the economics of it worked. So she suggested that I or somebody else that I commissioned write a piece about something more societal about pornography. And in the fullness of time, what I did was I wrote a piece about what pornography was doing to young people. It started as being a piece that was pitched as being what it was doing to people's brains, but there's actually very little hard evidence of what it's doing to people's brains, and quite a lot of evidence that there isn't this enormously strong rewiring effect that people think there is. Now, that may have changed in the time since, because porn has become even more addictive and hardcore, but anyway, that was the situation then. But what there is evidence of is how porn changes young people's practices and ideas about sex. So I wrote that piece, and in the course of doing that, I did a lot of research. I didn't look at any porn, as it happens, but I did read a lot of books about, for example, there's a very interesting book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, which looks at the evidence about what people watch and why. And it talked a lot about women's erotic literature as being the female equivalent of men and porn. Mm-hmm. And in the course of doing that, I read something that absolutely made my jaw drop, which was that a very significant part of women's erotic fiction is about 2 straight men in, they're straight in the background to the story, but that might be the original source if it's a fan fiction, or it might be the introductory material in a story if it's a standalone erotic novel. And those straight men have a sexual relationship. And this, this made no sense to me. It still doesn't actually make any visceral sense to me. Like, it's interesting talking to women about this. Some women get it and some women don't. But once I could think that, like, it's the female equivalent of what men call lesbian porn, which is, of course, nothing to do with lesbians, but it's women without men, I could intellectually make some sense out of it. And I ended up becoming super interested in this phenomenon, which is known in fandom, in fan fiction, as slash. So straight away people think slash has to be something to do with murdering people or something like that, but it's not. It's the punctuation mark, the slash sign, and it originated in fanzines before the internet in the 1970s when people were writing fan fiction about Star Trek. And in particular, a lot of the fan fiction, what we now call shipped, relationshipped, Kirk and Spock together. And that was known as Kirk/Spock or K/S. And this also blew my mind. I'm not a Star Trek fan at all, but my husband is. And I've seen more Star Trek than I ever wanted to out of the corner of my eye on the telly, and this made no sense to me. But I ended up reading quite a lot of academic research about it, several books about it. I interviewed women who had written these stories back in the day, and I discovered that this was all still alive and well on modern fan fiction websites. I hadn't even known these places existed. So they're called things like Archive of Our Own, fanfiction.net, Wattpad. There's a lot of original stories that are fanfics there as well. And to explain to people who don't know about what this is, it's original stories that use the characters from some source material. I just had a look to see what the most popular ones are, and they are, as they were 6 years ago when I first discovered all of this. It's the Marvel Cinematic Universe, so the Avengers and all the rest, and Harry Potter. And there's more than 500,000 stories, original stories that have been written by people using characters from those two. You can't make any money out of these things because the characters are, of course, copyrighted. J.K. Rowling owns the characters in Harry Potter, and people tend to write a disclaimer at the beginning saying, all characters are J.K. Rowling's. They often now put a bit of pious virtue signalling, like, may she come to her senses and soon. But then off they go and they write what they want.
Obviously disavow, yada, yada, okay.
Yes. I think she's a Nazi, but that's not going to stop me spending all day and all night for many years thinking about her characters.
Think about the universe she
created, it just shows you it just shows you how unserious this how fundamentally unserious actually the talk about J.K. Rowling being a horrific bigot is.
Yeah.
Because seriously, if I thought somebody was as bad as they say they think she is, it would put me right off.
Yeah.
The characters, to the extent that I just wouldn't be so invested in them. Anyway, so the stories tend to get uploaded with a bunch of tags which tell you the storylines, the characters, the relationships, the level of whether they're explicit or for a general audience. And over time, these become like everybody in the fandom knows what these things mean. So, for example, in Harry Potter, if you want Hermione to be with somebody who's other than Ron, the question is, how do you break her up from Ron? Is this done nicely or badly? Are you going to make Ron a villain, or are they just not right together? So people will say Ron bashing or no Ron bashing because people do or don't like Ron.
I'm on team Ron bashing, by the way.
Yeah, I don't like Ron either.
That's probably
anyway,
another subject. But anyway.
Yeah. But still, when I looked 6 years ago, the top relationship in Harry Potter, and I can't remember whether it was all Harry Potter stories or just the ones marked explicit. I think it was all of them. Because you can just sort. You can sort by filters and you can just count. Like you can see how many stories have a certain tag or how many stories are explicit or how many stories have a particular coupling in them. And the top coupling was Harry and Draco.
Uh-huh.
So the top coupling was a slash.
Yes.
It's now second, and Draco and Hermione is one.
Okay.
So that's surprising, to say the least. Mm-hmm. It tells you something interesting about human sexuality, I guess, female sexuality, and an article I wrote that came out in, I think, 2016, but maybe it was early 2017 for The Economist's lifestyle brand, which at the time was called Intelligent Life and is now called 1843, looked at what we knew about why women might want to write a story in which two heterosexual, seemingly, men fall in love, and how it's written in the style of romance or erotica novels aimed at women. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I didn't know that anybody was transitioning. I didn't know children were transitioning. I'd never given it any thought. I didn't know that significant numbers of the girls who write, and young women for these sites, had bought into something I'd never heard of, namely the idea that gender identity is real and sex isn't. So I came about 95% of the way to realizing that slash fiction might be a big influence on some of those girls. And then, a year later, I was asked again to commission or write a piece for the international section, and that one was on, why do so many kids say they're trans? And I got so into that I wrote a book, I left my job at The Economist, I became a campaigner, and I never again thought about fan fiction or slash. And I think it was a bit more than a year ago, probably about bit less than a year and a half ago. And I can't remember exactly why, but someone said something to me, or I was thinking for the umpteenth time, why do very gender conforming people get the idea that they are trans? And there's a theory for the men, which is those gender conforming people have a condition called autogynephilia, which is a paraphilia, which is that they are sexually aroused by themselves as women, the idea of themselves as women. And you only have to think of some of the very high profile, very manly trans women to realize how gender conforming they are in their hard charging, bossy, overriding women, insulting women who don't step in line. Like they're super gender conforming people as men.
Mm-hmm. We spoke quite a lot of this last time we spoke on this podcast last year, yeah.
But the girls who were transitioning, the first girls who transitioned were like the women, the minority of women, the tiny number of women who transitioned, say, pre-2000, in that they were butch lesbians, or they were women who found being a woman so very painful in the sense of they were so very gender non-conforming that they just really hated being women. But this was not true anymore, and it hadn't been true since probably the early 2010s. A significant number of the girls who transition now were very girly girls. And I had talked to some of them, in particular one I'd interviewed, Helena, from my book. She told me how she had liked ice skating, and the fandom that she got into was to do with 1950s music, rock and roll. And she liked the skirts and the dancing, which is a very gendered style of dancing, it's couples. And it's not that she and I talked about Slash, I don't think we did. But I thought I remember when I was writing about Slash, what people said to me was they said that these characters, although they're nominally men, they're not really men, they're in disguise, they're in drag. The male character, like the mention of the fact that they're male and their male bodies, even like the mention of their sexual organs, like this was even being described by the people who were studying Kirk/Spock back in the 1980s and 90s. They said, like, why the drag? Why do these women have to dress up what is actually basically a heterosexual couple as both men? And the answers they gave were to do with the unattractiveness of the source material of the women. Like women characters are much, much worse and fewer than male characters. To do with the fact that relationships often both in the world and in fiction between men and women are very unegalitarian, and they end with a happy ever after and the woman subsuming herself into the man's life. And I remembered this expression that somebody had used in a thesis that she'd written on Slash fiction, in which she said that perhaps Slash appeals to the woman who doesn't want to become Mrs. Hero, she wants to become a co-hero.
Mm.
And she has this ideal of a relationship that's a partnership of equals, where the two of you go on an adventure together. You don't fall in love with the adventurer, you two are an adventurer. And I thought, wow, I wonder, could Slash be something to do with kids transitioning, girls transitioning specifically? And I went back and looked, and it was in plain sight. I can't believe I didn't see it straight away. So another thing that they said in these is that the boys and men are not very like boys and men. Like the same woman who had written this thesis about Slash fiction, she said she had given some gay men that she knew some Slash to read, and they thought it was hysterically funny. Like that was the word she used, hysterical. And the men just laughed their arses off about it because it just isn't at all like gay sex to them. Like it was like the endless sighings and yearnings, the manufactured misunderstandings, the sex wasn't described in a very visceral way, like it's hard to know what's penetrating what, but it has all the tropes of women's romance and erotic fiction, in which, I mean, the best way I can say is the way that porn presents women as men would wish women to be, which is, interested in variety, uninterested in foreplay, very interested in multiple partners. All of those things in porn are men's wish fulfillment about women. Well, in Slash fiction, but in erotic fiction generally, the men are as women might wish them to be. So they're always talking about their feelings. They notice, the brand of clothing you're wearing. They're interested in things like, women's dainty wrists, or like she's got lovely long eyelashes, or things like I've never met a straight man who has any idea what length any woman's eyelashes are. Like really. But the men in erotic fiction do. They notice all these things. And so you realize that when you're writing these two men, and these two men are kind of like women in drag, basically, that if you're at a suggestible age and you're going through maybe female puberty, or you've had a tough time, or the boys in school are watching a lot of porn and talking about it, you're being sold an idea of what it might be to be a gay boy. That's not at all realistic, but is deeply appealing. Like, you're opting out of femininity, but you're not leaving behind things that are psychologically very important to you. And I mean, this has taken a while to explain, but the short thing that I've managed to learn to say to parents, because I have often said to parents, do you know what your daughter's reading? Like, they know to look and see what their son is looking at online, but they don't know to check what their daughter is reading. And they say, why, what? And, sometimes they actually say that their daughter writes fan fiction, and they think that's great, it's creative. And yes, it is great, it is creative, but are they sure what sort of thing she's reading? So I say to them, there's a lot of these stories in which they present being a gay boy as being something a bit like being a boy in a Korean boy band. That's the look, the fey, sweet, not very masculine at all sort of boy. And a lot of these girls, that's the boy they want to be. And that's the boy they imagine being when they transition.
So in these heterosexual pairings, say the Harry Draco pairings, do they have...
That's a homosexual pairing.
Sorry, right, but it's with heterosexual men. Well,
I see what you mean.
It's with men who are in the original fiction, heterosexual, made... Well, I suppose we don't really know that about... Anyway, let's not go into the Harry Potter details. It's with fictional characters who are ostensibly straight but have a gay relationship with one another in the slash fiction. Do they tend to play a kind of femme and masc role, or are both of them equally kind of Korean boy band, somewhere in the middle?
Oh God, just very varied. And I would say as well, it's changed a lot in the last 6 years, because another thing that's very useful and interesting about fan fiction as a source is that you can see when stories were uploaded, or when they were started, or when they were finished. So you can see trends. I actually think it'd be an amazing piece of research for somebody who has time to dedicate to it and has the skills to crawl a website and scrape tags and look at what changes over time. I would say that this is directly answering your question, but I need to say it before I answer your question, which is that in the 6 years since I first discovered fan fiction, it has become enormously more porny. So yeah, porn tropes, big time, have moved in. The sex is much more explicit, and it's much more sort of the things like spitting and slapping and choking and so on that, have become such a delightful feature of what young men are watching these days. That's in fan fiction now too, even though it's written by women or girls for other women and girls. So I think that it is less true than it used to be to say that these boys are not doing what looks like gay sex. I think they are a lot now. I think it's much more explicit about what it would be to have gay sex. And I mean, could I give any informed, data type driven sense of the, to the extent to which they are basically aping a heterosexual couple or not? I don't think I can. I don't think I, can give that sense. I mean, it's quite impressionistic what I can tell you about how things are changing and going on that. So if it's not in the tags, I can't give you a strong sense numerically.
Okay.
Is what I'm saying, and that isn't a tag.
But what I was wondering is it the case that you have these relationships where basically you have a real straight male character, and then the girls are imagining themselves in the role of the more feminine male character, or is it not that simple?
I don't think it's ever been that.
Right.
So in the article that I wrote back in 2016, 17, whichever it was, one of the things that people said, even in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, when they were talking about why slash fiction was popular, is they'd say, well, it's like men's lesbian porn. And then directly that you ask the question, well, why do men like lesbian porn? And so people asked that. I also asked men that, many of them, my poor colleagues at the time. And I mean, men tend to say very flippantly, because two women is better than one, or they say, because there isn't another man ruining my view. Or they say, well, if you look at porn with a man in it, that man feels like a competitor. Mm-hmm. But then another thing thoughtful people say, and this isn't only about porn at all, this is about fiction generally, including the written word. When you're reading relationships, and not even just sexual relationships, just you're reading two people, the point of view is something that can shift and isn't necessarily what the author chooses. You can think yourself into each character, and you can look at what it would be like to touch and to be touched, or to speak and to listen, or to be misunderstood and to understand at the same time. And that is one of the pleasures of reading. So a reason for having two of the people that you find sexually attractive on the screen is that you can imagine yourself more easily into both of them.
Mm. So it's not nearly as simple as the girls just placing themselves psychologically in the story.
Yeah, I think that relationships with two people of the same sex give people an easier in to enjoying the shifting point of view. So I think that a lot of it's written that way as well now, that it's a much less hierarchical and more balanced type point of view situation. And then another thing they said that I thought was very upsetting but very true was that, like in erotic fiction generally, it's the man is the point. Like the hero is the point. Erotic fiction and romance fiction stands or falls on the male character. The woman is often just a placeholder. And she's very difficult to write because if she's very attractive and very clever and very impressive, she feels like a competitor. So we're back to what men say about lesbian porn. But if she's kind of insipid, you don't like her. Like women who read erotic or romance books often complain about the woman. Like if you look at Goodreads, they'll complain about the woman and they'll say, oh, I fell in love with the man. So it can just be easier to just not write the woman at all.
Mm.
Because she's the character. Have you ever heard of a Mary Sue? Do you know what Mary Sue is?
No.
So Mary Sue is the shorthand for a self-insert, which is putting yourself in as the character in the fanfic. So any character who's not in the original, if you write your female heroine, like you write your heroine as a self-insert, like it's you going around like you're the one who fancies Harry, you're the one who fancies Draco or whatever, that's really looked down on. And the reason is because it tends to then just degenerate into sheer wish fulfillment, which is quite painful. And it's named after a parody short story that was written in a fanzine back, decades ago, back when it was Kirk/Spock. And Mary Sue was the name of the youngest ensign to join Starfleet. And the story's only about 500 words long from memory, maybe even shorter than that. So it's just a romp through. She's something like 13 when she joins, and she passes all the exams faster than anybody else, and she saves the whole of Starfleet from I'm now making it up slightly, but it's at this level. She defeats the Romulans, and she's cleverer than any what is Spock? He's a Vulcan. She's cleverer than any Vulcan. She gets the Vulcan order of whatever the Vulcans get orders of, and so on. And then she dies to be mourned by all in about 500 words. And it was meant to be a piss take of self-inserts into Kirk/Spock. So if you want to double down on what it is that women like about romance fictions, that's the hero. And if you want to take out the hardest thing to write and the most likely to piss off your readers, that's the heroine. So there's just a sort of structural thing, like just give them what they want. They like the men. Give them men.
Just give them double romantic heroes.
Yeah. And so then, they can both be different sorts of men, like, or at different times, at different times. Like one of them can be soft and one of them can be hard, and then it changes. And then the other thing about romance novels in general, and this is like 100% of them, what women find erotic more than anything else is that the man goes through a trial for you. The stories are stories of men being tested and their devotion to the woman being tested. So they often perform feats. Like that's why nursery tales and fairy tales, they tell of, men slaying dragons or defeating, dark lords or whatever. They do it to prove their love. And so I think, there's evolutionary reasons for this, but women want men to prove their devotion. And that used to be kind of easier to write when there were more artificial boundaries in society, because you could have, one of you is a Montague and one of you is a Capulet, one of you is a Roman and the other's a Catholic in Northern Ireland. One of you is working class and one of you is an aristocrat. And then in a world in which we're not meant to care about any of those things, although I suspect we sometimes do, or one of you is white and one of you is black, like you're not. So these things. The easy way to have a man who has to overcome barriers for you is a lot of those are gone. Mm-hmm. But what about a man turning gay for you? That's devotion. The one and only man in the world that this man would fall in love with. Like he has taken a leap. So that was another of the theories why Slash was so popular.
Do you think that's also why it's so attractive to write in fictional universes like in Harry Potter, where there are more artificial barriers? Like, again, Harry and Draco, there's a serious barrier
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
overcome in their romance.
Yeah, I mean, in general, fiction is easier to write when there's a big distance to move. So I was very surprised. I remember how surprised I was when I looked and saw that. I mean, I think it was Harry slash Draco and then Draco slash Hermione when I looked, and now those two are the other way around. But I had always thought that Harry and Hermione should be together. I always thought Ron was a bit of an aberration. But Harry Hermione is not a particularly common one. Like, it's there, it's got its fans. But the point about people who are very distant from each other is, yes, they've got to overcome barriers, but also it's just very interesting. How are you going to make this work? How are you going to do it? You've got 1,000 different ways people have written, more than 1,000. I mean, there's tens of thousands of Draco Hermione or Draco Harry stories. Like, how does Draco get over his prejudices? Does he break away from his family or not? How does Harry or Hermione, depending on which one you're doing, decide that they like him again, after whatever relentless amount of bullying and actually literally being on the other side of a genocidal attempt to get rid of muggles entirely, So there's distance, there's drama, there's obstacles to overcome, there's all the ingredients are there, and you don't necessarily have to be a very skilled writer as you would have to be to create this universe, because it's there, it's given. Now, there are some very, very good fanfics. There are some extremely well-written things there. And, if anyone wants to check them out, the way to do it is to sort by the number of kudos or reads. Like, you can just sort. I mean, some of them have been read a couple of million times. So those are pretty good stories. Like, they may not be your taste, but they're well done. But you can get like 10,000 to 50,000 reads on a story as a total amateur, because if you're borrowing other people's world building, characterization, and so on, a lot of the work is done for you that you would otherwise have to learn how to do as a fiction writer. So you can step in, and everybody knows the backstory of all of these characters. So you can just kind of get going. You can say, well, what if? That's the other thing that happens in these. An awful lot of the stories are what ifs. Like, what if Voldemort won? What if Voldemort had never existed? What if Hermione was sorted into Slytherin? What if Harry died in the first book? And everybody knows everything that you need to tell them with that. And then off you can go. You can just try and get your two characters together, or it can be funny, or it can be dark. You could totally see the appeal of it.
Selling 10,000 to 50,000 copies of a book would be amazing, right?
Yeah,
like, this is
exactly.
Yeah, this is big business. Although, of course, it's not a business.
Well, it's big business with no money. That's
Yeah.
the thing. You're not allowed to make any money out of this because you don't own the copyright.
Yes.
So nobody is making money out of this. But I think, there's these age divide things that we know about. Like, we know that kids are digital natives. We know that they are all on TikTok while the grannies are on Facebook and so on. But this is one that people haven't woken up to, that most people under 30, know at least the conventions of fan fiction, even if they don't write or read fan fiction themselves. And I think it's one of our bigger cultural divides, actually, because a lot of the things, like now when I hear, say, university lecturers talking about kids caring about trigger warnings and how they're all special snowflakes and so on, I realise how badly wrong the university lecturers are getting it, because they don't understand the reading universe in which these kids live. So if you think there's more than 10 million stories on Archive of Our Own, and that's only one of the big sites, so there's literally tens of millions of fan fiction stories out there, and a lot of them are pretty damn good. But there's far more than you could possibly ever read. And even if you just stick to a few big fan fictions, like, say, we just stick to Twilight, Harry Potter, Marvel Cinematic Universe, God, I just don't know enough about manga and yaoi and all of that stuff. But there's, like, if we just pick one of those, so we just pick 4, you're talking about several million stories. You're never going to read more than a tiny fraction of them. But if you want to sit down and read one, you're going to have to use the filters to help you. And you're quite quickly going to get to learn that you do or don't like alternate universes, that you do or don't like particular pairings. Like you said, you weren't a fan of Ron. You're probably not going to, if there's millions of stories to pick from, it's not going to be Hermione Ron for you. And you might actually feel like a bit of Ron bashing some evening. And so you'd look for that tag especially. So these kids, it's just that their idea of what Harry Potter isn't the books. It isn't just the books. Even if they don't read fan fiction, it still isn't just the books for them. It's the books plus this enormous penumbra of stories. And you are going to have to use tags to help you to find the ones that you might like to read, because there's just so many. And then while you're at it, if you don't like rape or non-con, as they call it, non-con is non-consensual and dub-con is dubious consent. If you don't like that stuff, you'll screen that out. I mean, there are clearly people who do like it, because there's a lot of stories like that. If you don't like torture, you'll screen that out. If you only want happy endings, you'll screen that in. And that's just what they expect out of reading. It's not actually about that they're snowflakes who would die if they saw the wrong thing. It's that they expect to be given some pre-sight of what sort of story this is. And in fact, there's an enormous amount of stuff that's deeply disturbing on these sites. And it's, as long as you put it in the tags, it's like a disclaimer. People can't complain. Like, people will, there's a particular phrase that's used as one of the tags, which is "dead dove do not eat," or just "dead dove." And it means there's going to be something truly disgusting and horrific in this story. And it's like saying, if you read the story, no comebacksies. You cannot complain. So it's really not about them being snowflakes. It's about them just expecting that you give them, as a sort of measure of politeness, but also to help them decide what to read, some visibility up front. And university lecturers don't know this. Like, I've actually told some of them this, and they're going, "Oh, that makes so much more sense. Now I know where they're coming from. It's not that I'm going to give them a choice about what to read, but I know what I'm speaking to now." Like, they had totally misunderstood what their students were saying when they said, "I expect a trigger warning," or, "If there's rape in this, I expect to be told."
Do you think also that they have a higher expectations in terms of optionality?
Totally. And I mean, but again, you can say that that's wrong as a lecturer, and you can say that you're not going to fulfill that, but it's good to know why they think that. They're not thinking it out of nowhere. This is the world they grew up in. So you would want to know that, to say it to them.
Do we have any idea what proportion of young people, and particularly girls, so I assume that this is overwhelmingly girls, right?
It is, yeah.
Do we know what proportion of girls are reading this stuff?
I have no idea.
Because we'd have to survey them, and no one's done that.
We'd have to survey them, but, there are many stories that have had more than 1 million views.
Yeah.
And, the sites, they're mostly English language, the big sites, but there's lots of translations as well. I mean, I would say it's a minority, but a small minority probably as well, but things that a smallish minority do leak out into the wider culture as well.
They're probably also, if these are young people who are that keen on absorbing lots and lots of text, they're probably quite intelligent. So they're probably going to be probably going to be overrepresented at universities. So more likely to be having an influence on these trigger warning culture stuff.
And it's also what a lot of the youngish women in journalism cut their writing teeth on.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's important to say a lot of it isn't actually about relationships at all. There's a whole, I mean, it's a relatively small one, but there's a whole sort of Harry Potter bit that's about how did it's the backstory to Voldemort's rise. And it's very smart, maybe somewhat neurotic girls and young women who are kind of obsessed with, like, how did Hitler come to power? How we got Trump, that sort of thing. And, Voldemort, like, doing the backstory of Voldemort allows you to think about how democratic norms can be subverted over time and so on. So one of my friends, actually, who would be, I would say, in her early 30s now, she had a name. She has refused ever to tell me. I'd love to go and read the stories, but she won't tell me. But when she was a teenager, she was writing, Voldemort's Rise stories. And now she is doing a PhD, and she writes a lot as part of that, and is actually one of the people I talk to when I talk about fanfic, because she's so knowledgeable about it. So there's people doing that sort of thing too. A lot of it's obviously just escapism, but I think it's a place where you can make a sandpit for any quirky or obsessional or specific thing that you want to have. I would say another thing that's happened a lot in the last 6 years, and I keep coming back to this question you asked about whether the gay relationships are quite heteronormative in their style. There's just a lot more gay relationships in general. So a lot of you said, like, Harry Potter is straight in the original. Well, yes, he goes out with Cho Chang, and I can't remember, does he go out with anyone else? Oh yeah, he fancies Ginny, doesn't he? He goes out with Ginny.
He gets married to Ginny in the end.
Almost every Harry Potter story, one of the tags is EWE, which stands for epilogue. What epilogue? Because this is the worst thing that you can do as an author, is have an epilogue, because you screw up pretty much all the options.
Yes, okay.
So nearly everybody just ignores the epilogue.
Okay.
In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a story that took the epilogue as given. Now that I think about it, I literally haven't seen one. Anyway, so Harry Potter, yes, he's heterosexual, but then a lot of the stories make him gay. Like even the stories that aren't about him, he is often put together with Theo, who is a boy in Slytherin. If he's not with Draco, like if that's not the main point that it's Harry and Draco, Harry is put together with Theo. I think Theo is barely mentioned in the books. I think he's just a name. I
Yeah, it
can't remember
doesn't
his
ring a
surname
bell.
even.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there's another thing that happens is things become sort of semi-canon. So canon is the original work, and then there's something that's called head canon or fan canon. And it's like so many people have written this that by now everybody thinks it's part of the original. So there's a character called Blaise Zabini in the book, and the only reason I don't think he's ever mentioned again, and if he is, it's very, very minor. In the first book, in the sorting ceremony, Hannah Abbott gets up first because her surname is Abbott, and she actually ends up getting a bit of a, gets some plot later on. And the very last person is Blaise Zabini, is sorted into Slytherin, and I don't think he's ever mentioned again. Well, Blaise is a very, very popular character, and by now he's got a whole bunch of characteristics. Like everybody writes him extremely handsome, ridiculously handsome.
I think he is mentioned later because he's a very handsome black boy and his mother's a model. It's mentioned as
his mother is a multiple widow. So. But I don't think he does anything really in the plot.
Okay.
Like it's ages and ages and ages since I've read these books. I read them several times with my boys, and I love children's fiction. Like I don't just love fan fiction, I like kids' books as well. By now there's a whole set of, like there's some different possibilities and you can sort of signal which ones you're going for. Like, there's another thing that you can do is Draco can stay bad. So you signal that, like you do unredeemed Draco or dark Draco, and then there's dark Hermione or whatever, So people really want to know what they're getting into because they know what they like. And it's like what you said about the optionality, but it's also just about visibility. And honestly, I like it because I don't want to read torture, for example. So I'd rather people told me if there's some torture in this book. I wouldn't look at it.
I check films. There's that website that does the Dog Die. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Which basically lists different triggers in different films, and it's compiled by a bunch of very online neurotics. So it's they prioritize a lot of weird triggers. But one of the reasons I check it is I don't want to watch children dying, and so I'll check before I watch a film.
Yeah, so there you go. I mean, I think most of us understand this impulse, especially when you think, I mean, I'm old enough now that I think like there's not that much time left, I've lived most of my life already, like certainly more than half of it and possibly 2/3 of it. I don't want to waste the time that's left on entertainment that I don't find entertaining. So I look back with astonishment at the time I wasted reading, endless French literature or films that my husband and I call Red Bean. It's a joke from Men Behaving Badly. They're trying to decide what film to go to, and the woman, the girlfriend, I forget her name in the program, she suggests Red Bean, and the other ones are, suggesting, I don't know, the latest Mission Impossible equivalent, whatever it was at the time. And I just would never go and see Red Bean now. I just don't like boring films anymore. I like to be entertained. And these kids, they probably feel like teenagers do, that life is endless and they have all these possibilities, but they're faced with millions of stories, literally millions, and they're all there and they're all free. So of course they want to narrow down. I mean, another thing that I think is really worth talking about fan fiction is it's very ungated and very uncategorized and unsorted. So yes, you can sort by tags, but the whole thing is just thrown into one bucket. And stories can be set as, are you over 18 to read it? But I mean, I can't see any way that they're stopping people who are under 18 from reading it. And the tags is the same. Like authors tend to add tags as they think of them. So if the story takes a dark turn, they'll go back and update the tags. And the result is that the tags are just all mixed together. So you become very used to seeing something that's a mixture of secondary couplings, if there's somebody who dies, really outre sex acts that have only come in from porn in the last few years, then epilogue what epilogue, and and it's just all stirred into one. So this is actually a child safeguarding nightmare because it's worse than just having awful stuff. Because it normalizes it. It suggests that you might like to look at rimming or cream pie or some of these porn terms. You'd make that decision in exactly the same way that you might make a decision about whether you like Hermione to be with Ron or Draco, or do you prefer happy ever after? Do you like alternate universes or whatever? And so it's got this incredible normalizing characteristic for absolutely everything.
Mm.
And like I said, these porn tropes are coming in. Now, I don't know whether that's girls watching porn, hearing about porn, knowing that boys are watching it, getting porn practices from going on dates. But I mean, to a very great extent, more than 6 years ago, the things that were really like unheard of, like really unheard of among girls 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, and that were only really coming into the common culture via Pornhub, are now totally normalized in these stories, both via the storylines and via this tagging. So it will say, slapping, choking, spitting, come as lube, um, and then it'll be something else, and those things will just be mixed in with jokey tags, Harry is gay, whatever. And I think it's girls grooming each other.
This kind of innocence that you mentioned earlier in the fanfic, where they're imagining men basically having female sexuality, has that been lost, or is it still that but adding in pornification?
I think it's the second, but women's erotic. I mean, erotica, whether it's men's porn or women's writing, is never realistic about the other sex. Like, it just isn't. That's the point. You imagine the other sex as you as in your sex would wish them to be. It's just a lot of wish fulfillment. So are these boys like basically girls? I would say maybe less so. Are they both boys as women wish men, and boys and men, like, I mean, I'm just saying boys, I just mean young men, as women wish them to be? Definitely yes, because it's not erotica, it's not romance if it's not like that.
So they're having still these very sort of romantic, emotional relationships, but then they're doing like aggressive sex
very
acts to each
things.
other.
But so are the girls.
Yeah.
So in the straight stuff, as in the heterosexual couplings, so are the girls. I mean, that is actually one of the more depressing things about it. I actually think that the heterosexual stuff now is probably driving girls towards trans identification as much as these idealized fake gay relationships that seem like an appealing thing that you get into,
because it's horrible.
So gross.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of it being very violent, very rough, like absolutely expected to have sex on the first date. And more the things look like copes. Like, I think a lot of women's erotica has always been quite a lot of a cope. Thinking about the fact that, men fundamentally often do very much disrespect women, or they lie to women early in a relationship. So it's always been common in women's erotic fiction to write, nasty men who are tamed by the woman, or men who've slept around a lot, but they're going to be faithful to this woman. Or, there's whole genres in Mills and Boon, always have been, where the man's a pirate and the woman is abducted. There's a whole genre in erotica that it starts with rape, and the rapist ends up being a good person. So these stories are, I think they're sometimes very neurotic. I wouldn't say always very neurotic, but sometimes very neurotic attempts by women to rationalize and cope with the fact that male sexuality is often pretty scary for women. And there's a lot of wish fulfillment as well, that you could start a relationship drunk, having sex with somebody, maybe even getting pregnant. Like that was popular in Mills and Boon a while ago. Maybe it still is. I read about 50 Mills and Boons that belonged to my aunt when I was in my teens, and I've read no Mills and Boons since. But there's a popular genre, which is you meet this wonderful man, you have sex with him once, you get pregnant, he finds out years later you had his child, and actually you end up together. And the last bit of that is just totally implausible. So it's a cope, it's a rationalization, it's wish fulfillment. And so a lot of these stories are now, they start with, drunken hookup, which is quite violent, which, is very porny. But he finds that he's hooked by you, and this turns into a decent relationship, and you redeem him by the power of your wonderful, I don't know what, femininity. And those stories wouldn't have started that way 6 years ago as often, I think.
Right.
Because this is the reality that girls are having to deal with now.
Yeah, so the consolations of romantic fiction. Although I wonder as well if part of what's going on with this sort of super macho, quite scary man who falls head over heels in love with you, the female protagonist, is that there's always been this tightrope that women have had to walk throughout our evolutionary history, where you want a man who is macho enough to defend you and defend your children from other men or other hazards, but you don't want a man who is so macho and high tea and aggressive that he'll hurt you or hurt your children. And so that kind of, you want a man who's like 8 or 9 out of 10 maybe on the sort of macho scale, or what you can conjure up in romantic fiction, which you can't conjure up in real life, is the man who is like that to everyone else except you. So you get this special carve out.
Yeah, the single most popular Draco Hermione story is a story called Manacled, which I find unreadable because there's a fair amount of torture in it, and it's a dark AU, but it's incredibly cleverly plotted. So it's Voldemort wins, nearly everybody is killed. Hermione is the only person left, and she ends up forming a relationship with Draco, who is seriously bad. Like, he is the right-hand man of Voldemort, and because of their love, she gets him to defeat Voldemort over time. But he's just a slaughtering machine. And there's loads more to that story than that. It's very cleverly done with 2 different timelines interwoven. But I mean, they end up together, and he is the world's scariest man, like literally the world's scariest man, and a mass murderer and mass torturer. But he's fixated on Hermione, and that is meant to be very romantic. So, I mean, I think it's the most popular, or one of the most popular Harry Potter fictions, because it's so good. Partly, like, it's extremely well written. And very, very, very clever in its interweaving of 2 different times. But it's also like, yeah, I mean, wow, it's like our evolutionary history is written there. Like, the world's most terrifying man who feels no pain, will do anything for you, including laying waste to large numbers of enemies, but he's very gentle to you. So yeah, it is the consolations of romantic fiction, as you say.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.